This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, it's 10 o'clock, and welcome everybody to another Wednesday Preservation Conversations. We hope everybody had a wonderful July 4th holiday, and we've kicked off our summer schedule. So for at least the next 2 months, our Preservation Conversations will be bi-weekly instead of weekly. But we're so glad that, that you've all joined in with us today live, or you're watching on YouTube after the fact. So today, we're kicking off our summer conversations series with a discussion about historic tax credits and preservation projects. And we're joined by special guest speakers from Epsilon Associates. And just in case you haven't, just in case you forgot over the week, or this is your first time joining Preservation Conversations, we just ask you to please mute your phone lines. It helps to cut down background noise and just makes it easier to hear our presenters. If during the course of the conversation you have a question that you want answered at the end of the session, please feel free to use the chat feature. It looks like the little conversation bubble in your GoToMeeting console. Just feel free to submit questions throughout the conversation, and we'll go through them when we get to the end. Any questions that we're not able to get to, we'll do our best to follow up with our guest speakers and get the answers back to you. And as you probably heard, this is being recorded, and it's going to be posted on our website and our YouTube channel probably within the next 24 hours. Oops, went the wrong way there. So we really started this way back on April 1st as a way to positively connect, communicate, and share, especially during some rather interesting times, but it's really evolved into a great way to share and discuss important preservation topics, continue our mission of education. And if you have any additional ideas for potential future conversations, please feel free to submit them to me, or other ideas for preservation presentations and workshops. My email will be up at the end of the conversation, as will Chris Skelly's from MHC. So today, as I said, we are talking about historic tax credits and preservation projects, and we're joined by two guest speakers from Epsilon Associates, Doug Kelleher, who's a principal with Epsilon, and Brian Lever, who is an associate in preservation planning. We have also on additional participants. We have the PM staff, and I believe we also have Chris Skelly from Mass Historic Commission on as well, in case any off historic tax credit questions happen to come up. So with that being said, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Doug and Brian. And first, a huge thank you again, Doug and Brian, for your participation in doing this for us. And whenever you need the slides advanced, just let me know. So the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Erin. This is Doug Kelleher, everyone. As Erin mentioned, I'm a principal here at Epsilon Associates. I oversee our historic preservation practice. Those of you who are not familiar with Epsilon, Epsilon is an environmental and engineering consulting firm based here in Maynard, Massachusetts. And among our specialty services that we offer here is our historic preservation practice, which, among other things, assists property owners and developers in securing state and federal historic tax credit projects for the substantial rehabilitation of historic properties. I want to start off by noting that some of the presentation will look familiar to some of you folks, who, particularly those who attended the statewide preservation conference last fall in Plymouth. Brian and I had a panel that included Dan Kolodner, an attorney with Klein Hornig, and Warren Kirschenbaum from the Cherry Tree Group, which is a tax credit investor, and a developer client of ours, George Vazvatiquez. So what we'll be presenting today is sort of a condensed version of the session that we had at the conference, but I would encourage folks to, if you're interested in sort of learning more about the tax credit programs, take a look at the PowerPoint presentation from the conference, which is available on the Preservation Mass website. Again, it's from the conference of fall of 2019, the Plymouth conference. As I mentioned, my name is Doug Kelleher. I oversee our historic preservation practice here. We have 6 historic preservation professionals, all of which meet the Secretary of Interior standards, professional standards. Many of the folks on our staff include former staff members of the Mass Historical Commission, the Boston Landmarks Commission, the Brookline Preservation Commission, the Newton Historical Commission. So we have, not only do we have a good sense of the program requirements, but we also have a good sense of the local review processes associated with local historic preservation regulations. So I also want to put in a plug. Not only am I principal here at Preservation Epsilon Associates, but I'm also a board member of Preservation Massachusetts, which I've been on the board for, I have to have Aaron and Jim remind me, 18 or 20 years now. So very active in the organization and happy to be here today. So with that, I will turn it over to Brian. Aaron, why don't we go to the next slide? And the next one. Excellent. Thank you.
So we're just going to briefly go over each of the following topics: the Federal Historic Tax Credit, the Massachusetts State Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit, the different program requirements for the state and federal programs. We also have a case study, which is the Plymouth Post Office, and a little bit on claiming the credits. Can you go to the next slide, Aaron? So the federal tax credit is a flat 20% of qualified rehabilitation expenditures, and it's returned as a credit on federal income taxes taken over 5 years. Projects must be substantial. They need to equal or exceed the adjusted basis, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The property must be listed or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places, and ultimately must be listed within 30 months of claiming the credit. The project has to meet the Secretary of Interior standards for historic rehabilitation projects, and it must be an income-producing property. There is a lot of confusion as to what is an income-producing property. That does not mean it needs to be a for-profit. It can be a non-profit use. It just needs to produce income. It could be an affordable housing project. It could be a community health center. It could be a variety of different things. We've done a couple of library projects, for example. The application process is a 3-part process, parts 1, 2, and 3. For the federal application, there are no deadlines. There's also no cap to the available credit. In case it got a little garbled, in case you didn't hear me, there is no cap to the available credits, unlike the state program. And the construction period for a single-phase project can be 24 months. For a phase project, it can be up to 60 months. Go to the next slide, Aaron. One of the key differences between the state and the federal program is that the state program is up to 20% of the qualified rehabilitation expenditures, the QRE. So while you're eligible for 20%, 20% is not necessarily guaranteed like the federal program. Another important difference is that the adjusted basis requirement is actually much lower for the state process. So projects have to be substantial and need to equal or exceed 25% of the adjusted basis. So you can do a much smaller project and still be eligible for the state credit. Additionally, the property must be eligible for listing on the national. It does not have to be ultimately listed like the federal program. Otherwise, the process is fairly the same. You have to meet the Secretary's standards. It must be income producing. There is a 3-part application process, 1, 2, and 3. The state program also has fixed deadlines, January 15th, April 30th, and August 31st. And another key difference is that the state program is capped with the amount of available credits, with $55 million available annually. That sounds like a lot of money, but it's a very competitive program, and there are far more applicants than there are available credits. Can you go to the next slide, Aaron? Most of you are probably familiar with the Secretary of Interior standards. I'm not going to go through them all, but they kind of fall down into some basic themes. One is to recognize those portions of the property that are historically significant. Second, theme would be to preserve those aspects that are significant. Restoration is not required, although it is certainly a benefit. Your part 2 is essentially your baseline. So if there's a feature that's been lost, while it could be restored, it's not necessarily required to be so. And the other sort of important theme is to understand that new additions, and we deal with a lot of projects involving new additions, should really be recognized as being new, but also be compatible with the project. Can you advance to the next slide, Aaron?
So as Brian mentioned, the credits are essentially based on what's referred to as the qualified rehabilitation expenditures, and commonly referred to as the QREs. The QREs include basically those activities or costs associated with the activities associated with the rehabilitation of the historic property. And that includes a combination of both hard costs and soft costs. For example, the hard costs, if you have a building that requires any masonry repairs, roof repairs, windows and doors, and that includes new windows and doors if the existing windows and doors are sort of deteriorated beyond repair, as well as mechanical, interior build-outs, all of your mechanical, plumbing, electrical. There's a few odd aspects of sort of the determining what qualifies and what doesn't. For example, carpeting does qualify if it's glued down, whereas if it's tacked down carpeting, that does not qualify. But generally, most of the costs associated with the rehabilitation of the property do count towards the credits. In addition to the hard costs, it includes a fair amount of your soft costs, including all of the architectural and engineering fees associated with the project, survey fees, as well as legal expenses, some financing costs through construction, and what's sort of referred to as a reasonable development fee. And sort of reasonable development fee is sort of anywhere between 10 and 15%. Again, those items that qualify and those items that don't qualify are the same for both programs, the state and federal programs. Next. Some of the non-qualifying costs include acquisition costs, purchase of the property, costs associated with the acquisition, new construction, basically expansion of the historic property beyond the existing footprint. Again, carpeting if it happens to be tacked down, as well as cabinets and appliances. So an easy way of thinking of sort of the non-qualifying things is those items that are sort of outside the footprint of the building, whether they be new construction or site work, or those items within the building that can be easily essentially picked up and carried out of the building, whether that be appliances, carpeting that could be pulled up if it's tacked down, and even cabinetry in some respects can be considered easy to be removed. As I mentioned, site work, and this includes landscaping, parking lots, sidewalks, and other site improvements. None of those costs qualify. And again, like I said earlier, the qualifying and non-qualifying is consistent between the two programs. So what's a building? So a building needs, the program is substantial rehabilitation of historic buildings, and a building is defined as a structure edifice enclosing a space within its walls and usually covered by a roof. Again, the building that must be depreciable. Depreciable buildings are generally those that are used for non-residential use, although, in other words, commercial use, or for residential that happen to be rental units. Private homes, private condominiums would not qualify. And this can include a range of building types, whether it be historic mill buildings, apartment buildings, commercial buildings, Main Street buildings, former municipal buildings. We do a lot of work on projects that involve the disposition of a historic municipal property, whether it be a former school. Brian mentioned the Plymouth Post Office, which we'll talk about a little bit earlier, as well as theaters, churches, hotels. Next slide. As Brian mentioned, both programs, state and federal, consist of a three-part application process, 2 and 3. The Part 1 application establishes the building's significance, evaluation of significance, and eligibility for the tax credit programs. The Part 2 application is a description of the rehabilitation. Part 2 application is the more substantive piece of the three-part application process, where it not only includes a description of the rehabilitation, but also documents the existing condition, identifies the key character-defining features of the property that make the property significant, and addresses how those key features are going to be retained and preserved as part of the project. Part 3 application is the final piece of the puzzle, where it's essentially a request for certification of the completed work and basically documentation of the work, and serves as evidence that the project was carried out and constructed in a manner consistent with the plans that had been reviewed as part of the Part 2 application. Slide. Part 1, and again, this is the same for both state and federal for the most part. It's basically an evaluation of the property's significance. Buildings which are individually listed in the National Register do not need to submit a Part 1 federal application. However, for the purposes of the state program, a Part 1 application is required. Next slide. Properties that are in historic districts obviously would also qualify. For those types of properties, a Part 1 application is required for both the state and federal applications. This is one of our projects on Oak Bluffs, the Wesleyan Hotel. Next slide. Properties that are not yet listed in the National Register but have been found eligible for listing in the National Register also qualify for the program. Those types of properties would require a Part 1 application for both state and federal. This is the Jewett Piano Case Factory in Leominster, which was a project of ours, which at the time was not listed in the National Register, and we would work with the folks at the Mass Historical Commission to get a determination of National Register eligibility so it could qualify for the tax credits. Next slide. For properties that are eligible for listing in the National Register only as part of a historic district, those also qualify and would also require a Part 1 application for both state and federal programs. This is a property, Gayworth Hall, out at the former Clark School for the Deaf in Northampton, one of our projects. This particular project includes 8 buildings on the campus of the former school. These buildings were not eligible for the National Register on an individual basis, but rather as part of a collection of the former campus. And again, this is a project that we secured both the approvals for the Part 1, Mass Historic, and the National Park Service. Next slide. Yep.
So the Part 2 is the bulk of the application. It documents the existing conditions, both in text and architectural plans and in photographs. It identifies the character-defining features, the key features of the building, the interior and the exterior. And in some ways, most importantly, it describes the proposed work and how that proposed work will maintain the character-defining features and be compatible with the Secretary of the Interior standards. Let's go to the next slide. There are a variety of issues that we commonly see on projects. One of them is stairs. Most of our historic preservation projects have stairs that don't meet current building code and require modifications to the handrails, often to the nosings as well, to be more compliant with building code and to accessibility standards. The other one is hallways, especially in buildings like schools, for example. They tend to have very large, wide hallways. In some sense, that is space that could perhaps be put to another use, like as part of a residential unit or an office space. But typically, that's an area that needs to be preserved in order to maintain the building's historic circulation pattern. Go to the next slide, Eric. Another issue we see are significant and large interior spaces. Theaters, churches, auditoriums, and schools, for example. They can be quite challenging in trying to find ways of putting them to another use. In many cases, we have to preserve the volume, or at least a portion of the volume in those spaces, in order to retain some of their historic character. There have been a variety of creative different ways that this has been achieved in varying different projects with glazed partitions and partitions that divide vertically rather than horizontally to maintain some of the volume. It can be challenging, but it's also in some ways kind of the most rewarding part of the project. Can you move to the next slide, Aaron? We have some examples here of some interesting masonry repairs that have occurred over time, in particular in the photo at the right. We deal with a lot of repointing and a lot of masonry buildings. It is always a challenge to try to find, in particular in a building that's had multiple levels of repointing, what the original color might be, and to try to restore that if possible. Essentially, in any area on a building that you touch, own it. You're required to change it in a way that would be considered historically appropriate. If it's not a part of your scope, it doesn't necessarily have to be restored or made more compatible with the historic building. Next slide, Aaron. Entrances are another area that we see a great deal of concern and scrutiny. It's another issue also that where we have to try to comply with historic preservation standards, building code, and also accessibility. We do a lot of projects that require handicap accessible entrances or modifications to existing entrances in order to make them accessible. Sometimes this means constructing a separate accessible entrance on a building or a ramp on an existing entrance that preserves the stairs underneath, or other types of creative problem solving. Next slide, Aaron. Sustainability is also an issue. We do a lot of projects that have rooftop solar installations. Those actually can be really beneficial in that they provide, an extra source of cost savings to a historic property and addressing some of the electrical usage. And if they can be done in a manner that they're not visible or not particularly visible from the street level, that really works out quite well. Insulation is another issue that we see, and the National Park Service has guidelines essentially on where they're willing to have insulation expanded or placed within the historic building's interior. Generally, if you have exposed masonry, as you see in the photo to the right, they want to keep that exposed. Next slide, Aaron. Windows also get a lot of scrutiny. Typically, we need to provide very detailed drawings as part of the Part 2 application. Oftentimes, the National Park Service wants to review window shop drawings before they are ordered to make sure that the replacement window is compatible and not substantially different from the original window that remains. The material is a little bit different. Oftentimes, we can get an aluminum window as a replacement, and that tends to be actually, in some ways, a better replacement than a wood window, simply because of the type of wood that's available today. The wood windows, the replacement windows, tend to be a little bit thicker and chunkier and tend to not be as appropriate as, in some cases, as a metal window. Next slide, Aaron.
So as the Part 3 application is sort of the final piece of the application process and serves as documentation of the completed work, and basically serves the purposes of proving that the project was constructed in a manner consistent with the plans that had been previously reviewed and approved as part of the Part 2 application. We pretty much go through and provide similar views that we have from the Part 2 application with sort of after photos, so that it makes it easy for the folks at the State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service to sort of compare the two. So they have a set of essentially before photos from the Part 2 application and after photos from the Part 3 application. The Part 3 application also includes final project costs and QRE amounts, whereas the figures included in the Part 2 application are really estimates throughout construction. Certain aspects of the project, that there may be increases in costs, there may be, decreases with some items. So the Part 3 application includes sort of the actual costs that were sort of spent as part of the rehabilitation. application also includes the completion and place in service dates, and identifies if there's been any changes in sort of the ownership entity or partnership as the project has moved throughout the construction. The photos that you see here are some before and after photos. These two here from the Salem Jail, which is obviously a very historic complex in Salem, Massachusetts, with a historic jail and jailkeeper's house. Next slide, Aaron. Here's a couple of photos of a former trolley car barn, which had been converted into residential use. Next slide, please, Aaron. This is some before and after photos of a large mill complex in Haverhill, Mass. That we were involved in. The Hamel Leather shoe factory. It consists of 4 mill buildings. I forget the number of units, but in the, I think, 400 to 500 range, a considerable amount of new residential in downtown Haverhill. Next slide, please. The Plymouth Post Office, this is a project that we worked very closely with the developer, George Vazvatikas. And again, this is a project that those of you who might have attended our session at the Preservation Conference, George was one of our panelists and sort of, from his own personal experience going through this process. This was a project very unique in that former post office, but a former post office that had gone through a substantial rehabilitation and received federal historic tax credits back in the early 1980s. Had only received, at the time the state program didn't exist, but is an example of a project that had been substantially rehabilitated and reviewed and approved by the National Park Service in the early 80s. And this one was particularly interesting for those of us who look at these types of projects on a daily basis to sort of see what type of activities were approved in the early 1980s as opposed to what's commonly approved today. Next slide. So as I said, this was a former post office. It had historically been built as a post office, but in the early 80s had gone through a disposition through the U.S. Postal Service, who had maintained a smaller presence within the building. But the building had largely been converted to commercial uses. So there are several small retail establishments on the ground floor with some offices occupying the upper levels. These are before photos. Next slide. Again, some views of the commercial spaces that had been built out as part of the work done in the early 1980s. Next slide. And some after photos of the current project. So a big piece of this project was sort of expanding the U.S. Postal sort of tenant space within the building. So it has more of a sort of historic use again, with the post office occupying more on the lower floors. Part of that work included, the removal of a lot of the interior build-out that had been done as part of the earlier project from the 1980s, as well as the extensive amount of restoration of the marble lobby, walls, floors, and trim details, as well as historic fixtures, including the light fixtures, the writing tables that you see here in the lobby. Next slide. The upper floors, as I said, had been historically used for office space, actually for the as a custom house, and included in that was the safe in one of the office spaces on the upper floors. You'll see that some French doors had been added to the far end of the building. That was work that had been done as part of the early 1980s rehab. Next slide. And this is as it looks today as part of the recent project, which the upper floors have been converted to residential use. Pretty nice, sort of high-end, where a lot of the historic finishes, wood trim, historic doors, transoms, terrazzo floors, plaster walls, all of which have been restored as part of the recent project. Next slide. That safe that you saw in the earlier slide from the custom house space was retained, and actually the safe itself was removed. The historic door to the safe was retained, and what occupies what was the former safe is now a walk-in shower as part of one of the master bedrooms in one of the units. And what you see on the photo on the right is the kitchen and living area of one of the new residential units. Next slide. Another shot of that safe door. This project also included a rear addition, basically built on a single-story rear wing of the building as part of the upper floor residential build-out. Like I said, there was a second-story addition that was added to that lower level. This is sort of the top of, which is sort of the penthouse unit. Slide. The project also included, extensive restoration of the historic, features of the building, which not only included, the elaborate fan lights and the two gable ends of the building, but also the truss work within the attic space and its conversion into a new penthouse unit. Next slide. As well as the historic clockwork materials in the clock tower of the post office. This was, the clock had, long been dormant, many years of, hadn't been upkept and had not been upkept. Clockworks were no longer working, and included a full restoration of not only the mechanical equipment, but also the clock facings of the four sides of the clock tower. Next slide. Again, additional photographs of the completed project on the exterior. This is a property that I know Aaron and Jim go by quite regularly. It's right down the street from the Preservation Mass office, and certainly has added a lot more vitality to the ongoing efforts in downtown Plymouth as part of the revitalization activities, and certainly the greater prominence of the post office within the building sort of contributes to that activity. Next slide.
So at the end of the process, the credits belong to the taxpayer that owns title to the property. Essentially, they run with the property. They can be issued to nonprofits and for-profits. Most applicants sell or syndicate their credits to investors. Some retain and use them for their personal use to reduce their income taxes paid. Credits are subject to recapture in the event of inappropriate alterations or sale of the property during a 5-year recapture period after the credits are claimed. This doesn't come up very often, but in the event, say, someone wanted to do a tax credit project and then decided to demolish the historic building, for example, the credits would be subject to recapture in that instance. Most people don't ever run into this scenario.
Right. As well as a requirement of both programs is that the applicant or the proponent who's receiving the credits needs to retain ownership of the property for a 5-year period following the completion of the project. If the property was sold within that 5-year period, it would also be subject, the credits would also be subject to recapture. Again, this is a pretty rare occurrence that this happens, although we have had property owners who have called us, in year 3 or 4, saying that they have have an offer for the building, and we warn them that the remaining credits are certainly subject to recapture, and sometimes they still go forward with the sale and sort of essentially forfeit the credits that they had remaining. Other times they continue to hold on to them for the completion of the project. Next slide. So before we move into the sort of question and answer section, I wanted to sort of touch on some efforts sort of underway to sort of increase the attractiveness of the program. Some of you folks may have heard that there's efforts as part of packages to stimulate the economy as a result of the recent experiences, economic experiences we're all experiencing due to COVID. Now that includes increasing the credits at the federal level from a 20% credit to a 25% credit, increasing, the use of the federal tax credit program for smaller projects or more Main Street type projects to make it easier for those types of projects to qualify, as well as increasing the size of the credit for those types of projects from a 20% to a 30% credit. All of these efforts and initiatives are obviously certainly beneficial to these projects. We certainly look forward to seeing how these all play out. Again, both of these programs, the state program and the federal program, are very popular, particularly here in Massachusetts, but also across the country. The vast majority of states in the U.S. have state programs that are comparable to the federal program and comparable to the Massachusetts program, albeit with some minor differences. But certainly any efforts to improve the usability of the credits and increasing the credit size is all welcome news to the development community. So with that, Aaron, I think we'll turn it back to you folks to maybe go through some questions that might have come in, or any questions that you folks may have.
Great. Doug and Brian, thank you so very much. This was hugely helpful. And yes, I neglected to mention earlier on that Doug is on our board of directors and has been a long-serving, very active, supportive member of our board. And thank you also, Doug, for touching on efforts to increase and enhance and improve these important programs, both the federal and the state historic tax credit. The federal historic tax credit, for anyone who doesn't know, it almost completely went away when comprehensive tax reform was passed at the very end of 2017. It was basically taken out of the tax code, and the program would have completely gone away through the very last minute efforts of a number of members of Congress, including obviously Congressman Neal, who holds an important position on Ways and Means, but also some I believe it was Senator Kennedy from Louisiana, who was able to get it back in the Senate side. The program was put back in, but it has been altered, and the improvements that Doug was talking about, the federal tax credit, improvements that have actually been included in something called the Moving Forward Act that was passed by the House of Representatives. It's now over on the Senate side. I'll put some information about this up on our Preservation Massachusetts website. And I also wanted to point out that Preservation Massachusetts is actively working to enhance the program at the state level. Our lobbyist has been active over the past few weeks, reaching out socially distance-wise, because there really are no in-person meetings on Beacon Hill, to do two things: to try to get an increase to the cap of the state credit. We're looking somewhere in the range of another $10 to $20 million, but also to extend the sunset date on the program. The state historic tax credit program has been in place, obviously Doug and Brian know, it's been active since 2004, but the program's always had a sunset date. So it's currently slated to sunset at the end of 2022, and we're going to try to push that out another 5 years to 2027. So hopefully we're going to be able to get into, or at least be included in the governor's economic development bill. We've been working on that over the past couple of weeks. But anything that increases the effective, increases the amount of credits that can go to projects in the state is hugely important. So with that, I'll get off my little soapbox and we'll take some questions. So we have had a couple that come in. One of them, what types of properties are best suited for tax credits? If a property is owned by a municipality, that wouldn't be worthwhile, correct? So Doug, Brian, do you have any, are there any types of properties or ownership structures that tend to work better for tax credit projects that you've seen?
Sure. So properties that are owned by municipalities, unfortunately, don't qualify for the tax credit program. That being said, there is the potential, if there's a willingness on behalf of the municipality, to transfer sort of ownership of the property. And it could be transfer of ownership through a long-term lease to a nonprofit entity that could hold the property and essentially undertake the rehabilitation, and then that entity could apply for and receive credits which could then be syndicated because obviously that nonprofit entity would not have a need for the credits. So, I guess there is a possibility for that, although there's a lot of challenges associated with that type of project, but it is possible. But really, for the most part, any property that is a income producing, and that can be a combination of residential, rental properties, as well as commercial properties, and again that whole range of properties that we went through earlier as far as commercial buildings, theaters, former schools, former churches, could all certainly qualify. So those are sort of the more common types of projects that we see.
Great. When you were talking about eligibility and historic districts, if the building is within a district, it has to be contributing to be eligible for either of the two tax credit programs, correct?
Correct. And what we found with some of our recent projects, we have had some properties that are within historic districts, but were actually built to be sort of after the period of significance for the district. For example, we had a project in Salem, it's a commercial building right in the downtown. It's in the downtown National Register district, but was built in the 1950s. And when the district was listed in the National Register in the early 1980s, it was outside of the period of significance. It was less than 50 years old. I think the period of significance ended in the early 1930s. So being constructed in the 1950s was outside of the period of significance and was therefore considered non-contributing to the district. In that case, we worked with, again, the folks at Mass Historic and the National Park Service in getting a determination of National Register eligibility for the building. In that case, what we needed to do was to amend or update the historic district nomination for the district to expand the period of significance so that this property's sort of status could be converted from non-contributing to contributing. And I guess that's one thing that I would, for those of you who are on local historical commissions and sort of serve at the local level, I would say, that is the area in where you could sort of have the most influence on sort of encouraging folks to apply for these types of programs. You understand who the property owners are, who the developers are in your communities, and working with them and encouraging them to consider tax credits as a means of doing a rehabilitation of a historic property in a historically sensitive manner. Again, all of these projects have to comply with the Secretary of Interior standards, whereas those projects that are not pursuing credits don't necessarily need to preserve the character-defining features per se of a building. And as well, those commissions that are active in creating National Register districts, creating districts in your downtown commercial areas is certainly a way to encourage property owners to pursue tax credits, because again, by doing so, you're essentially addressing the Part 1 question as far as, is the property significant, is it eligible for listing in the National Register? Communities that are active in creating National Register districts are doing the lion's share of the work in establishing that. So I would encourage folks who serve on local historical commissions to think about that as you sort of consider your annual work programs, to look at areas that are eligible for the National Register and sort of take the lead on creating those districts.
Great, thank you, Doug. That's hugely helpful, and I think it is interesting to point out. I think I know the building you're talking about in Salem specifically, but just because something may not have been deemed significant when districts or initial surveys were done, the 50-year rule, it's a constantly moving date. So if we're looking at things that done in the early 60s, that can qualify. That would qualify for for listing on the National Register. So it's always a good idea to encourage local historic commissions to keep things like that in mind, and it's always an opportunity. So another question, and I think you kind of touched on this a little bit when you answered the first one. Can a church that remains in use as a church take advantage of tax credits?
I guess I would say the quick answer to that is maybe. It's pretty unusual. you need to sort of demonstrate that it's a church that sort of falls into the category of an income producing. That being said, if you have a church building that is used for social functions, that can be leased out, for different events, under those circumstances, it could certainly qualify. Again, they would need to sort of have a nonprofit established to sort of hold the property, and again, whether that be through outright ownership or through a long-term lease. But it is a little bit, those types of projects are a little bit tricky. But I would encourage you to look into a little bit further, because there is some possibility for those types of projects as well. And again, I'll just sort of.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Doug.
Just say I'll put in another plug for taking a look at the PowerPoint presentation from the fall conference, which included, as I mentioned earlier, Dan Kolodner, also a Preservation Mass board member, from Klein Hornig, who sort of talked about more of the legal side of things, certainly much more than what we've touched on today, as well as Warren Kirschenbaum's thoughts and as from the investor side as well.
And I was just going to say a little plug for the historic tax credits can be seem, especially if you're not familiar with them, or just only have a very a passing acquaintance or knowledge of them. They can seem very, very daunting. I mean, Doug and Brian have gone into a lot of detail. There's a lot of requirements, there's application processes. It can seem overwhelming and maybe very easy to dismiss as, oh, that's something that's too hard, it's not going to work for our project. But don't discount them or rule out having a conversation with a preservation consultants like Doug and like Brian. We'll get at us at Preservation Massachusetts, we do field a number of calls about tax credits. Would it work for this project? Or even people applying for tax credits. They have questions about the application process, what they need to do. I always encourage them, you need to talk to a preservation consultant, because people like Doug and Brian have the experience. They've worked on a number of projects. They know the process, they know the players, and they're going to be able to give you a better sense of, yes, it definitely can work, or maybe it's at first glance, it may not seem like it can work, but let's see what we can do, and there might be some opportunity here. So talking with a professional, like the team at Epsilon, is a very, very, very good step. And that's the first thing that we do when anyone talks about historic tax credits. You want to talk to a professional, you want to talk to somebody who can really help guide you, and who has experience with projects, all over the state, different types of projects too. There's just a whole wide swath. So a plug, and if it seems daunting to you, reach out, have a preliminary call or an email. I know Doug and we throw a lot towards to Epsilon, especially saying, can you answer these questions? But it's really important, and these programs can be hugely helpful. But talking with people who have experience in doing this is hugely helpful, and it'll save a lot of headaches on your end and frustration. So that's the plug. Can you, Doug and Brian, can you elaborate a little on what the funding looks like to the applicant? You said they keep it for future tax credits against revenue from the property, or sell it to an investor. What does that mean? Can you give us a little thumbnail of how the funding scenario with tax credits would play out?
Sure. Typically, I would say the vast majority of our projects, they sell or syndicate their credits to an investor. Essentially, an investor is someone who partners in your project. They have a very small and very temporary ownership interest, and it's kind of a swap where kind of one or two scenarios plays out. In some projects, if you as the developer or nonprofit, if you don't have enough funds to complete your project on your own, what you might do is have an investor who contributes equity, and they contribute funds to you at a discounted rate of 10, 20 cents on the dollar, and they provide those funds for you to help move your project along. They might provide you some funds, towards the startup, at the middle, and then at the end. And when your project is done, they get the credits, and they get the credits at a discount. And what you've received is funds that allow your project to be completed. In other projects, if the developer has the funds to complete the project, it's a swap essentially towards the end. Where the project is completed, the developer receives the cash, again at a discounted rate, and the investor receives the credits. Typically, we see the state credit sells for 92 cents on the dollar, somewhere around there. The federal credit's a little bit less. It tends to be in the the high 80 cents on the dollar. If there are more credits, you can sell your credits for more money. If you have less credits, well, then there's a smaller pool of potential investors. No one wants to buy $1,000 worth of tax credits for a project. It's not worth it for that much. The paperwork alone would make enough of it. But if you had hundreds of thousands, or if you had millions, you would find that your rate of return would be better. We also find that we do a lot of affordable housing projects. In fact, a large chunk of our projects are affordable housing projects, and they also get tax credits, low-income housing tax credits. And if you combine varying different types of credits, low-income housing, new markets tax credits, historic credits, you sort of package them all together, you tend to find that you are able to get an investor who's willing to pay more for them.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. As Brian mentioned, many of our projects are affordable housing projects, and they're, in addition to receiving the historic tax credits, we're receiving the low-income housing tax credits. There's other tax credits out there, whether they be brownfields tax credits, solar tax credits, new market tax credits, a whole variety of sources. And sort of the more creative developers experienced in this area are those that really know how to sort of combine these various funding sources to help finance their project. And again, sort of the benefit to the proponent or the developer who's going to be syndicating the credits is they're able to turn these credits, which they may not necessarily have an immediate need for. In other words, they don't have the tax credit or the tax liability and don't need the credits, and to basically convert them into equity to help finance the project. And the benefit to the investor who's purchasing the credits is they're able to buy these credits for slightly less than face value, but yet use them for the full face value to offset their own tax liability. So.
Yes, and thanks for bringing it up, Doug and Brian. A lot of projects specifically that we see using these historic tax credits are often using other forms of other programs, and a lot of the time when we're specifically advocating for these programs in Washington or on Beacon Hill, we kind of like to use the word, but we like to use the phrase, but for these programs, these projects wouldn't have happened. I mean, these are, and Doug and Brian can probably talk about this all day long. A lot of these projects are so very challenging. The private sector probably wouldn't have been feasible otherwise without the use of historic tax credits. So another reason why this program is hugely important and useful for communities. So next question, can you talk more about the availability of the state tax credit program? Which development is more likely to be approved?
Well, the good news or the bad news, depending on how you look at it, is the state historic tax credit program in Massachusetts is very popular. And because it's popular, it's very competitive. And it's very competitive based on the fact that it's a capped program. As Brian mentioned earlier, the Mass Historical Commission, who administers the state program, has a cap of $55 million on an annual basis to distribute to these projects, the 3 applications. Again, $5 million sounds like a lot, but it's nowhere near the demand. We hear that Mass Historic receives anywhere from 250 to 290 applications in each application.
Right? I literally didn't know who that card was from.
Hey, Aaron, could you mute someone for us?
Yep, I just did. Just a reminder, even though we're coming to the end, if you haven't, please mute your phone so we can hear the answers from Doug and Brian. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Doug.
So as I was just saying, the state program is very competitive, which is, in many respects, a good thing. It certainly shows that there's a lot of interest in Massachusetts in seeing these historic properties rehabilitated. But unfortunately, the the amount of credits available is nowhere near the demand, so it makes for a very competitive program. And as far as, which projects receive the credits, Mass Historic looks at, not only just the work that's being done, in other words, how the project complies with the Secretary of Interior standards, but they also look at other factors. They look at, does the include an affordable housing component? In other words, the project creating additional affordable housing units within a community, that's seen as a positive. What are the other economic benefits of the program, of the project? In other words, how does it contribute to downtown revitalization efforts within the communities? Mass Historic also likes to see these projects, or these credits distributed across the Commonwealth. In other words, they like to see these credits going to projects in the Berkshires and Central Mass, in the Merrimack Valley, on the Cape, and on the islands. They like to see the credits to, dispersed as widely as possible across the Commonwealth. So there's a lot of factors that sort of go into MHC's review of applications. It's obviously, as I mentioned, very competitive program. Mass Historic has many things that they look at, not beyond the scope of work. In addition, they also like to see that the credits go to a variety of building types. Occasionally we get some unusual building types, and I think folks at Mass Historic like to see these credits go to many different building types. So there's obviously, I think we can all point to many different historic mills that have received these credits, but there's also unique buildings in every community across the Commonwealth, and like I said, they like to see these credits go to as many deserving projects as possible.
Great, thank you, Doug. And actually, that answered that kind of your response answered another question that we had, which someone was asking about what the state uses criteria for approving applications. So thank you. So I think one last question, and okay, where is it? Where'd it go? Can you speak more about restrictions that are put in place when pursuing tax credits and how to keep those from deterring applicants?
So I would say this sort of touches on some of the things that Brian mentioned earlier as part of the part 2 and sort of the common issues. Again, Mass Historic and the National Park Service apply the Secretary of Interior standards in their review of these projects. And a key aspect of that is seeing that the character defining features of the building, as well as the character defining spaces within the building, are retained and preserved. And that can be challenging for certain buildings. Brian touched on, examples of, in historic schools where there's wide corridors and auditorium spaces within the building. Those are all features that, need to be retained and preserved as part of a project. And that can be challenging. But, with a, creative architect, and I would, encourage folks to, as they consider, whether or not a certain property or project would be a good candidate for tax credits, it's good to, not only get the input from a preservation consultant, such as Brian and myself, and our colleagues here at Epsilon, but also an architect who has experience with these types of projects, who's familiar with the Secretary of Interior standards, and has a good sense of, these types of things that, both Historical Commission and the National Park Service look at. Finding creative solutions for having a historic stair be retained, but yet still be brought up to current building code and life safety code requirements is key.
Great, thank you, Doug. I think that is hugely important, and especially with the whole creative aspect. I mean, this is kind of, preservation is about creativity, and especially the projects that that we see that are applying for the historic tax credit, state historic tax credit. A lot of them, people have to get really creative, not just with the financing, but with how they're going to use their space. And I think with examples and successful results like the Plymouth Post Office, which Doug said, it's literally like 50 yards from our office, and that's where I go to buy all our stamps and send all our mail out of. And it was awesome to see the before pictures, because I'd never seen it before. George and 1620 Capitol had done the project, so it was a little odd to see the big cosmetic display where we usually go and drop off our mail. But But just to finish up, a huge thank you to Doug and to Brian for giving us such a wonderful presentation and walkthrough about the Historic Tax Credit Program. If you want a little more in depth, as Doug said, the Preservation Massachusetts website has an archive of all presentations from the 2019 conference, and you can find their presentation on historic tax credits there. They had a full 90 minutes to present for that. They only really had, 35 minutes for this. So thank you so very much. This was hugely important and a great topic to cover. And these programs are really important, and I think they do. They bring a lot of value, and it's not just historic preservation. It's revitalizing economies, community development. So if you have any further questions about the tax credit program, specifically to Doug or Brian, you can, their emails were up on the slide, or you can email me and I'll be happy to forward your question on to Brian or Doug. And if you have any other suggestions for future presentation or workshops, my email is up here along with Chris Kelly from MHC. And just one final answer, yes, this presentation is going to be made available on the Preservation Mass website and our YouTube channel. It should be up by probably by the middle of the day tomorrow. So, so we have some upcoming conversations. As I said, we're on a bi-weekly schedule. We're still finalizing our 2 topics for the next 2 weeks, next 2 sessions, excuse me. But on August 19th, we are going to have a discussion about stone walls, how to identify, document, and evaluate them in historic landscapes with a special guest presenter, Jeff Howry. If anybody on here was on our historic stone wall preservation conversation 2 weeks ago, you'll know that was a hugely popular one. This is another way to, we're going to talk about how we as individuals can identify and document historic stone walls. So. Thank you again so much, Doug. Thank you, Brian, for sharing and helping educate us about historic tax credits. Thank you, everybody, for watching live or on YouTube. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Preservation Massachusetts at any time, and have a great day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.